Back with Wilt Chamberlain against Bill Russell and so on and so forth. I feel as though it's only...
They called him Goliath. The man who once scored 100 points in a single night, who made the basket seem smaller and every defender look helpless. Wilt Chamberlain was a force of nature's 7 feet of power, speed, and precision that the world had never seen before. But behind every roar of the crowd, there was a silence only he could hear. The kind that follows a man who stands too tall, who wins too easily, and who begins to wonder what victory even means. In the new documentary Goliath, his image flickers again, not the giant holding the rim, but the man staring back at the camera, older, thoughtful, almost fragile. It reminds us that every legend eventually faces the same opponent, time itself. Wilt didn't just battle players, he battled perception, loneliness, and the weight of being too perfect. They changed the rules for him. They widened the lane, banned certain moves, adjusted the game to contain his dominance, yet nothing could contain the questions that followed him. Could someone so powerful truly belong in a team sport built on balance? Could a man who redefined scoring ever learn the beauty of sharing the ball? This is not the story of 100 points. It's the story of how Wilt Chamberlain, the most unstoppable man on a basketball court, learned to be more than unstoppable. He learned to evolve. From Russell's intellect to Reed's heart, from Thurmond's grit to Kareem's grace and Hayes' relentlessness, each rival shaped him in ways no record book ever could. He was more than the numbers, more than the myth. He was a man chasing connection in a game built on competition. When Wilt Chamberlain entered the league in the late 50s, he looked like a visitor from another planet. 7 feet tall, leaping like a guard, built like a prizefighter, it felt unfair. Yet across the court stood a man who didn't try to overpower him. Bill Russell studied him. He watched the timing of every hook, every pivot, every exhale before a shot. And when the moment came, Russell would simply be there, a hand in the right place, a body already waiting. It wasn't brute strength that stopped Wilt, it was anticipation. Their duels became the heartbeat of the decade. Boston against Philadelphia, mind against muscle, philosophy against nature. Russell never tried to match Wilt's numbers, he played the game behind the numbers, positioning, rhythm, leadership. He understood that basketball was not about domination, but about connection. And that idea cut through Wilt's armor more than any blocked shot ever could. Night after night, Wilt would score 40, 50, sometimes more, and still lose. He'd stare at the box score and see greatness with no reward. Across the locker room, Russell's team would celebrate, their unity louder than Wilt's records. For years, this rivalry defined both men. One measured success in rings, the other, in records. Yet the irony was that both were learning from each other, Russell proving that defense and teamwork could rule the sport, while realizing that pure force was not enough. By 1967, when Wilt finally led the Sixers past Boston, he wasn't the same Goliath. He passed more, talked more, trusted more. The mountain had learned from the mind. And though he won that battle, he often said later that Russell had been the only rival who ever truly made him think. By the time Wilt Chamberlain met Willis Reed on the grandest stage, he was no longer the untamed giant of the early 60s. He had learned patience, calculation, and the quiet pride that comes with experience. The 1970 NBA Finals brought his Lakers against Reed's Knicks, two teams that mirrored their captains. Wilt was the towering veteran seeking redemption. Reed, the stoic leader carrying New York's hope on a battered leg. What unfolded was not just a basketball series, but a test of heart against endurance. In Game 5, Reed went down, his thigh torn, his face locked in pain. Many thought the series was over. Wilt dominated the paint, rebounding, scoring, controlling every breath of the game. The Lakers looked unstoppable. But then came the night that would define both men. Game 7, Madison Square Garden. As the teams warmed up, a familiar cheer rose from the tunnel. Willis Reed was walking back onto the court, limping, defying logic. He scored only a few points, but his presence set the Garden on fire. The Knicks fed off his courage, every rebound echoing louder than any dunk. Wilt looked across at Reed and saw something he couldn't overpower: resolve. Each possession felt heavier, each cheer felt personal. The Lakers fell, and the Knicks won their first championship. In the box score, Wilt's numbers dwarfed Reed's. But in memory, Reed's limp became immortal. Years later, Wilt admitted that Knight taught him more about leadership than any coach ever could. He realized that greatness isn't always measured by dominance, but by what you give when everything hurts. When the buzzer sounded, Reed's smile was small but eternal. Wilt walked off quietly, head high, humbled not by defeat, but by courage. He had met strength of a different kind, the kind that plays through pain and lifts everyone else higher. By 1967, when Wilt finally led the Sixers past Boston, he wasn't the same Goliath. He passed more, talked more, trusted more. The mountain had learned from the mind. And though he won that battle, he often said later that Russell had been the only rival who ever truly made him think. Nate Thurmond was not the loudest man in the league, nor the most celebrated, but to Wilt Chamberlain he was the one opponent who felt like a reflection carved from stone. When they first met, Thurmond was a young, relentless defender out of Bowling Green, built like a wall but moving with the rhythm of a dancer. Their clashes were brutal and silenced, no trash talk, no theatrics, just two men testing the limits of will and endurance. Wilt had been used to overwhelming others with power. Against Thurmond, that power met its echo. Each time Wilt backed him down, Thurmond held his ground, forcing him to fade away, to spin, to rethink. The games turned into chess matches played above the rim. Fans came expecting thunder. Instead, they witnessed a quiet struggle of balance, positioning, and pride. Nate was relentless on the glass, meeting Wilt rebound for rebound, minute for minute. He never flinched, never complained, never broke. And in that silence, Wilt saw something new, a version of himself that existed without the applause. When Thurmond became his teammate briefly in San Francisco, their practices were as intense as playoff games. Wilt later said Nate's discipline made him sharper, more aware of the small things, the pivot before contact, the angle of a bounce, the timing of a handoff. Against most centers, Wilt could rely on instinct. Against Nate, he had to rely on thought. The granite had forced the mountain to become mindful. In their later duels, long after the box scores faded, Wilt spoke of Thurmond with rare reverence. He said Nate wasn't just a rival, he was a mirror, the one who showed him that strength could be silent and respect could exist inside the battle. It wasn't about who won, it was about who endured. And both did. By the early 70s, Wilt Chamberlain was nearing the twilight of his reign when a new kind of giant emerged, tall, calm, and impossibly graceful. His name was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and his signature move, the skyhook, seemed like poetry written above the rim. It was a weapon Wilt could not block, a motion so smooth it defied the brute logic of defense. When they met, it wasn't just a battle of size or strength, it was the passing of time in slow motion, one generation watching the next rewrite the story. Wilt, now wearing the purple and gold of the Lakers, understood what was coming. Kareem was not a challenger to be crushed, he was the future arriving early. In their first duels, Wilt still fought with his body, anchoring the paint, contesting every touch. But soon he realized that he was no longer playing to prove his dominance, he was playing to understand evolution. Kareem's game was built on angles, rhythm, and serenity. Wilt, once the storm, had to become the mountain, still, immovable, enduring. The skyhook kept floating over his reach, a reminder that even greatness has its successor. Yet Wilt handled it with a new kind of grace. He no longer measured worth in points or rebounds, but in the satisfaction of holding his ground against a talent molded in his own shadow. The league had changed, faster pace, new stars, new expectations, but Wilt adapted with dignity, becoming the mentor, the guardian of an era fading into memory. When Kareem later joined the Lakers, the torch was officially passed. Wilt smiled at the sight, knowing that the game would remain in intelligent hands. The rivalry between them was never bitter, it was reflective, a bridge between dominance and wisdom. The mountain had met the sky, and together they defined what basketball could become. By the time Elvin Hayes came storming into the league, Wilt Chamberlain had already faced every kind of opponent imaginable, thinkers, warriors, artists of the game. But Hayes was something different. He was young, fierce, and restless, a player who attacked every possession as if trying to outrun time itself. When they first met, Wilt was nearing the end of his career, and Elvin was just beginning his. Yet every clash between them felt like the collision of eras, youth crashing into wisdom, raw energy meeting calm mastery. Hayes never feared the legend. He sprinted the floor relentlessly, demanded the ball on every trip, and challenged Wilt on every rebound. For Wilt, those games were no longer about dominance, they were about endurance. He had to manage his body, pick his battles, and rely on anticipation instead of explosion. The younger man forced the older one to think deeper, to find peace inside the pressure. Every blocked shot, every post move carried meaning, a small lesson that time might take away speed, but never purpose. Alvin's relentlessness reignited something in Wilt. He admired the hunger, the fire that reminded him of his own youth, the days when the crowd's noise was fuel and not echo. Yet watching Hayes push through fatigue, dive for loose balls, and never stop moving, Wilt understood that greatness isn't only inherited, it must be chased, again and again. Their duels in the early 70s were physical symphonies, two centers at opposite ends of their timelines, each defining the other's journey. When the buzzer sounded, Wilt would often pat Hayes on the shoulder, the gesture of a teacher who had just been taught. In Alvin's relentless storm, Wilt saw the final lesson of his career, that strength, once a weapon, could become wisdom, and that every giant must one day learn to yield without surrendering his pride. In the end, Wilt Chamberlain's story was never just about numbers. The 100 points, the 50 rebound games, the towering records, they were echoes of a man searching for meaning beyond applause. Through rivals like Russell, Reed, Thurmond, Kareem, and Hayes, he learned that greatness isn't about standing above others, but standing long enough to understand them. Each of those men chipped away at the myth until only the truth remained, a man, flawed and brilliant, learning to turn power into purpose. Time, the only rival he could never defeat, became his quiet companion. As the years passed and his footsteps faded from the court, Wilt found peace in reflection. He saw how the game had evolved, how young players studied his tapes, how his name still appeared whenever someone reached for the impossible. He understood then that immortality isn't found in the scoreboard, but in the inspiration that lingers. The giant who once towered over everyone learned, at last, to stand beside them. He became a teacher, a storyteller, and a reminder that even the strongest must someday bow to time, but only after leaving something behind that time cannot erase. Because in the story of basketball, records will fall, banners will fade, and heroes will be replaced. Yet the legend of Wilt Chamberlain endures not for what he conquered, but for what he transformed. He showed that dominance could evolve into grace, and that even the mightiest Goliath could find peace in being human. So, when the crowd grows silent and the lights dim, his name still whispers through every arena, the man who changed the game and learned to change himself.